What makes up a nice pose? How do you easily draw poses from reference or come up with them on your own? If you want to be able to draw nice poses, studying gesture can help a lot. I'm currently on a journey of learning about the fundamentals of art from YouTube, and I want to share what I learned. This is part 3 of this series, and today we'll be covering gesture, or rather how to draw good poses, since that is what the videos I watched were mostly about. This video functions as a summary of the most important points I learned from the videos I watched and how I now, through combining the information from the different videos or artists, would explain the topics. I also point to different videos or YouTubers you can study from depending on what your focus is and what you want to draw later on. Overall, I watched 16 videos from 7 different artists, and from what I learned, I'll now first show you the basics and my own way of breaking it down. For gesture, I'll separate this into drawing from reference and coming up with poses. Firstly, for references, especially if you're a beginner, I recommend using them a lot first. Even advanced artists tend to use pose reference. You can use photographs of real people, but also study other artists' work. Just make sure that you're not claiming it as your own and give credit. When you're focused on drawing the body, it makes sense to look for a reference where it isn't hidden by big flowy clothing. If you want to challenge yourself later on, you can try to figure out where the body is underneath though. Also, it's important to choose a good reference and make sure the silhouette of the body is clear. It should also look dynamic. You don't have to go crazy with foreshortening and so on, especially in the beginning, but just choose poses that look nice to you and have flow. And now I'll present the steps I would take to study from a reference. Step 1 is to break the reference down. You can use different things here. For example, 2D shapes like squares, triangles, rectangles, or also 3D volumes like cylinders or spheres. Another thing you could use is a line of action the body is following, or kind of a stick figure with balls for joints and volumes for the torso. Up to you what you want to use. You can either trace over the reference or draw from it. Then step 2 would be to draw the pose yourself. Pay attention to the proportions, the relations or shapes you identified when breaking the reference down. If you want to, you can also stylize the pose and make it more extreme or adjust the proportions. Just make sure you first understand how the pose in the body works. I like to construct the body using volumes, lines and shapes for this, but if you're especially focusing on quick gesture drawing, it's often about using quick lines to get the pose down. Depending on what you want to learn about when drawing from the reference, you can change this. And now we go on to coming up with poses yourself without references. For step 1, you can first think about the personality of the character you want to draw and an action they could be doing to come up with a convincing pose. If you don't have a character in mind, you can also just use dynamic lines or start with a perspective you want the character to be in, or a silhouette you want the character to have. Also, if you're using a pose for an illustration and already have other objects in it, you can make the character fit into it and maybe interact with the environment. I would then start with a rough thumbnail sketch for the pose. Now we move on to step 2, which would be experiment. You don't have to do this, but especially when you're drawing digitally and you're not completely satisfied with how the pose looks right in the beginning, you can rotate the arms, the legs or the torso with transform tools. It's good to pay special attention to the hands and feet here. They can add a lot to the pose. Also the head angle. You can also already think about the expression you want your character to have here. As mentioned in step 1, if the character has a specific personality, you can make the pose fit to it. For example, there are different ways to portray a character taking a selfie or falling down. And now we move on to step 3. When you figured out your pose, you can think about exaggerating parts of it if it fits. Also look for lines or shapes in it, and if you're using your pose for an illustration, it overall fits into the composition of the image. Check the silhouette. Is it clear what the character is doing? Also check the perspective. You can use guidelines or break down the pose with 3D shapes to do this. Finally, then I would move on to step 4, drawing the pose. Now we move on to the second part of this video, which is about the most helpful tips. And I'm taking the tips from different artists in particular here, so I mentioned them. First we have Marc Brunet. Some of the tips he mentioned were to pay attention to the balance of the character, the center of mass, and thus the weight distribution work than with symmetry. Often symmetrical poses look unnatural, and it's a good idea to break symmetry of a pose. And if you want your character to feel balanced, it's especially important to have the feet's placement on the ground work. The next tip is about observation. It's important to observe the pose before starting to draw. You can take as long as 5 minutes to just observe. You can learn a lot just from looking at the body and analyzing it. For studying, it's good to use references and study the things you need later on, since you should have a reason to store the information you're learning. It will just help with really keeping it in your head. Next, you can combine references. I do this a lot, especially for hand poses. I use a reference for a pose and look at how the hands are angled here and what hand poses would be possible. Then I look for hand references from there. You can also use separate references for the head angle or something like that, for example. The next tip, if you want more dynamic poses, you can have the character you're drawing be involved in a motion like running or throwing. And finally, if you want to enhance a pose, you can change up the camera lens, the perspective, use composition, and add hair or flowy fabric. And then I also have a tip from Draw Like a Sir. To come up with poses, you can use flat dynamic cross lines, or something else I found very interesting he mentioned was to do random line drawings and turn them into a pose. Now for the third part of this video. This is about some exercises you can do to learn about gesture. First, you can do 1-minute gesture drawings, only focusing on your drawing speed and the silhouette. You don't have to do a lot of breaking down here, only in your head. You can draw using mainly outlines and lines that show the flow of the pose. Next would be to act out a pose and take a reference image, or even better, take a video of yourself while acting out a pose. This way you can be aware of how it feels to do a pose and maybe also what muscles are flexed. After you've taken this reference material, you can draw from it. The next exercise would be to redraw a pose from a reference and then compare it, putting your drawing on top of the reference. You can see changed proportions this way and correct what you got wrong. This is especially helpful to break down different artists' style. It's also good to find out if you have a general tendency to maybe draw the hands too small, the eyes too far apart, and so on. For me, I did a similar exercise to this in an older video, and I noticed all my bodies are thinner and everything tends to be less foreshortened when I draw from a pose that has a lot of foreshortening, for example. The next exercise would be to take an animation and pause it frame by frame to find the best pose to you. Like this, you can learn what in general makes up a good pose for you, and also how the body works when transitioning in between different key poses. The last exercise I mentioned is to redraw an old artwork and try to enhance the pose, maybe exaggerate it or change something about it. And finally, I recommend different videos that go into more specific topics, and depending on your interests, you can pick which ones you want to check out. First, we have Marc Brunet. I also mentioned some things from his videos in the tips. His videos are especially helpful for finding a way to draw poses with references or without them. Then we have Ethan Becker. He has a lot of breakdowns of artists, which can help you with identifying shapes you can use to break down poses and other artists' work. And that's it for this video. I hope it helps you with drawing poses, and have a nice day.